Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about poems and poetry itself. I have been a sort of slow convert to poetry. I read quite a lot for when I was at school and for uni, and I sometimes am a bit nervous around poetry. I think because it can feel like you're doing it wrong when you read it. You know, it's kind of sometimes hard to really think, am I reading this at the right speed? Am I kind of doing this too quickly? Am I getting everything? It's a hard medium sometimes, I think, but I think it has just so many riches at its heart. And so I really wanted to talk about a few poetry collections that I've really enjoyed. And this is sort of as well partly spurred by the first one that I'm going to talk about, which is a poetry collection I read recently and just absolutely fell in love with. And it made me realise that I want to do a bit more of this. And that was Andrew McMillan with Physical. Now, part of the reason I was reading this is I have been reading the Polari Prize shortlisted books from this year, which is a sort of prize for LGBTQIA+ literature. And Andrew McMillan won in a previous year with this collection. And I absolutely see why. This is a collection of poems all about the body, particularly male bodies, and particularly male bodies and masculinity and how those things interact with each other. And this is just such a startling collection because the poems just, they are, without kind of accidentally throwing in the cliche and the pun here, they are very physical. They jump off the page. There's a real almost brutality to some of the terms used sometimes, and sometimes a real softness. And it really, for me, does sort of capture that idea of masculinity. Of at one point, Andrew McMillan, well, the poem's narrators are in gyms, sort of watching men having sort of worked out and then sort of finding a sort of soft sort of moments in them, and sometimes it's watching a young boy sort of try to navigate what it means to be a man in a world that can be quite harsh to sort of young sensitive men. And it's really beautiful and interesting, and I just absolutely fell in love with this. I had to take it very slowly. I think the thing I've been finding with poems recently is it works best for me when I go and sit alone with them for a bit and I read them out loud to kind of really get that sort of power from them. And I just absolutely loved this. Another collection that really spoke to me was Night Sky with Exit Wounds by Ocean Vuong. And this I listened to as an audiobook, which I think was the right way actually, because hearing him talk about this book was these poems, and particularly his some of his other work, there's again this real beauty of his language, the ability to sort of switch between violence and softness in sort of within a couple of words. And I just found it really captivating, and it reminded me a lot of another collection I had read recently that I absolutely loved, which was Fleche by Mary Jean Chan, which also grapples with the idea of sort of family and tradition and her kind of Hong Kong identity, and that alongside sort of the UK and for Ocean Vuong, that against the US, and this real sort of telling of these stories of what it means to be sort of almost seeing themselves as sort of transplants of sort of one culture into another. And I absolutely fell in love with both of these collections. I just thought they were so clever. And Mary Jean Chan in Fleche also examines quite a lot through this idea of not only flesh and the female body, but also, which is the sort of the play on words that she's going for, but also flesh as in the foil or the tool used in fencing, and this fencing as this sort of extended metaphor for kind of a sort of silent battle almost, which I just thought was really powerful and just absolutely blew me away. Next, some poetry that has sort of really shaped me as a reader, and I mentioned them I think a while back for sort of a video I did for my 32nd birthday to kind of talk about 32 books that really shaped me. And these two books are both definitely within that. The first being Caroline Duffy's The World's Wife, which I'm not sure if you can kind of see, but there are kind of all these scribbles on because I studied this at school, and which I was very lucky for, because we had an English teacher who clearly just was sort of like, right, we're engaging with the difficult, fun, issues-based stuff, and I'm not letting you sort of go without having, you know, thought about some of these things. So I really love this. And The World's Wife is a collection of poetry where Caroline Duffy looks at various people throughout history and either reimagines them as women, or imagines a sort of a female partner, or some sort of female relation to them. So, for example, we have, let's think of a good example. So, Mrs. Darwin, for example. So, imagining Darwin's wife, the sort of beleaguered woman who's really annoyed that Darwin keeps on looking at all these animals instead of her, and even including, you know, sort of people like Medusa, who have been sort of misunderstood or perhaps misrepresented, at least in Caroline Duffy's mind, over the time. I absolutely love this collection. There's something so powerful about it, and this is one of the first books that really got me into poetry and thinking that it was something that I could enjoy and love. And another one that really kind of spoke to me sort of similarly was Leaves of Grass, which I'll bring closer, by Walt Whitman. And I love this. Sort of every few, well, probably about every 5 or so years, I will sit and reread this. And it's a book that I have to sort of almost experience as this sort of rapid flood of writing, because it is such an alive and vibrant book, and it charts Walt Whitman kind of examining nature and sexuality and love and bodies and so many things, and there's this real freedom to it. This book feels like a sort of liberation for him. He's sort of really expanding and growing and bursting with this sort of energy, and I absolutely adore it. For me, this is just such a brilliant collection, and it's so breathless, it's so genius. I always really love returning to this just because it feels like it speaks to me in some way. There's a real kind of queerness and a real sort of hippiness almost to it in a way that's so freeing, and I absolutely adore this collection. Another collection that I really enjoyed, and was one that I was sort of introduced to when I was about 17 or 18, and it was sort of really transformational as well in terms of how I looked at poetry and what it can do, was Crush by Richard Siken. And this is just such a beautiful collection. And again, you might notice that there are sort of similar things that I seem to like in most of these collections. This is very physical and violent and queer and soft, and it's incredible. It does so many things. So essentially Crush plays again with that idea of this word crush, because it not only talks about crush in the romantic sense of having a crush on someone, but also in this case a car accident. So Richard Siken lost his partner in a car crash, and this collection sort of both examines that sense of loss and the trauma of that, but also delves into these softer moments of really watching their love unfurl. And it's just one of the most beautiful things I think I've ever read. It's just, it manages to do so much in such a short amount of time that I was really just blown away by this. It's really stunning, and I really need to go back and reread it because it's been a very long time. But it's so great to see how poems can really, when there's a collection that feels like it has a real voice and a real focus, it can examine things in such a beautiful way. Also, there are lots of really exciting voices that I think have been coming out recently in poems that I've read and thoroughly enjoyed. One of which was Poor by Caleb Femi. And this is just such a stunning book, I think, in examining race and class in London, particularly sort of this young man growing up around sort of a housing estate in Peckham. And it does this in a really clever way of just, again, this really visceral language that both captures sort of slang and kind of how language is used sort of locally for him, but also sort of brings it into focus alongside some other things going on. And I really enjoyed this. I just thought it was so sort of groundbreaking in how it sort of, there's no holds spared. It is brutal, it's violent. It also has this real softness and kind of cleverness and sort of dexterity with language that I found really quite engaging. And I read it around the same time as Roger Robertson's A Portable Paradise, which also looks at For example, the Grenfell Tower, which for those of you outside the UK was a tower in London, where lots of working class and people of sort of ethnic minorities lived in a part of London, right next to some really very posh upper class areas in London, and it had this old cladding on it that was very flammable. But basically, for years, local people had been saying, like, look, we need to do something about it, and it kept on getting kind of pushed further and further away. And then there was a fire, and many people lost their lives. Many people lost their homes because they couldn't go back to this tower, and it was revealed sort of that increasingly, like lots of other people also had similar cladding in their kind of giant sort of blocks of houses or of sort of flats and apartments, and particularly in the poorest areas. And A Portable Paradise is a real writing back of a sort of a black man asserting his voice, and calling out the kind of the injustices of something like Grenfell, and of the Windrush scandal, which was a scandal where many people from the Caribbean who had come to the UK in the 1960s were suddenly had their kind of immigration status changed and were sort of treated as if they were their sort of status had been basically changed, and they were treated as immigrants instead of as people who had been living in the UK for 40, 50 years. And at the same time, government sort of loads of documents were destroyed, lots of things were done that was very kind of shady and very strange. And this collection calls this out, but actually at the same time finds a real beauty in detailing the lives of people affected by these two scandals. And I just think it's such a defiant collection. It's brilliant. It's so angry. It's so vibrant and vital, and at the same time really looks at the kind of inner lives of these characters and these people in a way that's so humanizing. And it's brilliant. This collection is just sort of fiery, and I love it. It's so brilliant. And I picked it up kind of purely by accident. I was just in a library and just saw it, and I was like, oh, let's give this a shot, and then absolutely fell in love with it. It's brilliant. It's so good. And then just to sort of round off, just a couple of others that I've really enjoyed in sort of recent times. The first was The Tradition by Jericho Brown. So this won the Pulitzer in the US, and it's a story of a black gay man talking about his identity, and various sort of identities and how they intersect, but also that against the backdrop of the USA, and particularly, he talks about his HIV status, he talks about bodies and violence, and again has this real softness where he talks about love and sort of togetherness, but that against this real sort of brutality. And there's something that was so alive and beautiful about the language of this that I was so drawn into. It's really clever in how it talks about these kind of unstated and unsaid moments between people, and particularly between lovers. I thought this was just absolutely brilliant. And I'd also recommend alongside it another prominent American woman who is Audre Lorde. Her collection, she wrote poems a lot throughout her life, and I kind of only really encountered her poetry for the first time in a collection of other works of hers, and I found it just so startling because I hadn't realised she wrote poems. I only really knew her for essays and sort of other bits, but Your Silence Will Not Protect You was this really brilliant collection of a lot of her work, and it included some poems, and there's this real, again, softness, particularly her articulating her queer identity in a way that feels so revolutionary and feels so radical, and I really strongly enjoyed it. So those have been some poems and poetry collections that I've really enjoyed. I'm sure there are millions that I've forgotten to mention here, but I'd love to hear some recommendations from you, particularly because I am still a bit of a sort of wandering, I was going to say wandering deer, is that a thing? That's not a phrase, Bob. It should be, I can put it in my poetry collection. I just, I'm still relatively new to finding lots of new poems or poetry, and any recommendations people have, I am happy to kind of look into, because it's an area of literature that I know very little about and would like to know more about. Anyway, I've been Bob. Take care, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. Bye bye.